speaking, Retell Lecture Guided Practice. Let's begin this session. Before I start, let's see how we'll go about this. I'll show you the image that accompanies the lecture. After a few seconds, I'll play the audio. And when the audio ends, you'll have about 10 seconds to record your response. So if you need more time, you can pause the video and then I will show you the response and we'll discuss it in a step-by-step manner. The few seconds that you have when the image is on the screen and the audio has not started, that time is to be used to sort of guess what the lecture is going to be about, so that you are in a better frame of mind to listen and to capture the necessary phrases or to understand the meaning from the lecture. So based upon the image, you should try to understand and try to guess what the lecture is going to be about. Let's begin with the first question. I'll now play the lecture.
For years, we've been hearing about the loss of high-paying U.S. manufacturing jobs. Many think that manufacturing is declining in the U.S. because companies are moving their operations offshore to markets with lower-cost labor, like China, Mexico, and Vietnam. They also think trade agreements sometimes are unfair, like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because these trade agreements allow companies to re-import those cheaply produced goods back into the US and other countries from where the jobs were taken. So it kind of feels like the exporters win and the importers lose. Now, the reality is output in the manufacturing sector in the US is actually growing, but we are losing jobs. We're losing lots of them. In fact, from 2000 to 2010, 5.7 million manufacturing jobs were lost. But they're not being lost for the reasons you might think.
Let's see the sample response. The speaker talks about the loss of jobs in the US manufacturing sector and the misconceptions around this trend. Most people think that jobs are being lost because they are moved to cheaper destinations, such as China and Vietnam. However, such reasoning is not correct, and the real reason behind manufacturing job loss is something else. After all, the output of the manufacturing sector in the US has been growing. In the first step, you look at the image, and when you look at this image, you see there's a worker doing something with a motorcycle, and it looks like a factory kind of a setting. So it's a worker in a factory, an automotive factory. Based upon this, what can you predict about the lecture? You can safely say that the lecture will be something to do about workers, about manufacturing. Broadly, yeah, it will be about workers, manufacturing, and maybe it's going to be about jobs. And then when the lecture starts, the next step, that is you have to visualize, you have to take notes, and you have to try to understand the key points. There are a couple of times the speaker manufacturing, etc. So that again, especially when you combine it with what you guess from the image, tells you that the focus of the lecture is manufacturing sector, and more specifically, the speaker talks about jobs, job losses, moving from one country to another. So that's the main theme, the loss of jobs in the US manufacturing sector. How do you identify the main theme? It is usually the word or the concept that is repeated often. It can be repeated in different ways, using different words, using different phrases, but they all tend to relate to the same thing, okay? For example, output, manufacturing, jobs, all of that, they essentially is about dealing with the topic of jobs in the manufacturing sector in US. And then whenever the speaker mentions words like because, therefore, however, that's an indicator that now he's giving a reasoning or going to present a counterpoint, going to give an explanation. So in this case, he says that people think that the reasons for job loss is because they are moved to cheaper destinations, but that's not the case. So those are the key points. And once you have those key points, then you put them together in a structure. That is an intro, a couple of sentences, the key points, and then maybe some kind of a conclusion. So here the intro is, the speaker talks about the loss of jobs in the US manufacturing sector and the misconceptions around this trend. Then he gives a couple of points. And in the end, he says, after all, the output of the manufacturing sector in the US has been growing. Another way we could have ended To conclude, the lecturer summarizes that the reasons are different because the output of the manufacturing sector is growing. So there are different ways you can do that. If the final point is robust enough, important enough, then it can serve the purpose of the conclusion. So for example, here, it's a good point. It gives an explanation that the reasoning for job loss is not correct because if you look at the output is growing. So it means something good is happening. So just blaming countries like China and Vietnam for job losses is not correct. So always the conclusion will not begin with the words to conclude or in conclusion. You can use them as a template if you are to make some kind of a generic statement, but there are other ways to conclude as well, as we have seen in this example. Let's now go to the next question. You have the image. I'll play the lecture soon.
How many companies have you interacted with today? Well, you got up in the morning, took a shower, washed your hair, used a hair dryer, we had breakfast, ate cereals, fruit, yogurt, whatever, had coffee, tea. You took public transport to come here, or maybe used your private car. You interacted with the company that you work for or that you own. You interacted with your clients, your customers, and so on and so forth. I'm pretty sure there are at least 7 companies you have interacted with today. Let me tell you a stunning statistic. 1 out of 7 large public corporations commit fraud every year. This is a US academic study that looks at US companies. I have no reason to believe that's different in Europe. This is a study that looks at both detected and undetected fraud using statistical methods. This is not petty fraud. These frauds cost the shareholders of these companies and therefore society on the order of $380 billion per year.
Sample response. The lecturer talks about the presence of corporations in our life and how many of them are involved in fraud. On an average, a person interacts with a minimum of 7 companies a day, whether by using their products or in the form of customers or employees. It's shocking to note that on an average, 1 out of 7 public companies are involved in fraud. This costs the public about $380 billion in a year. It can be concluded that corporate fraud is a major problem in the US. So now when you look at the image, you can guess that the lecture is going to be about fraud. As you can see, there's a currency symbol, there's some numbers. So maybe there's going to be a mention of some money related to the frauds. And when the lecture starts, the lecturer starts walking us with step by step through different products that we use and starts talking about how many companies we interact with in a day. Now, when you try to understand the central theme, you tie what you have understood from the image and what you hear. So you see that this is, because it talks about companies, etc. So it's about corporate fraud, how companies indulge in fraud. A very important way, a very important tool to remember and understand is to visualize. I've been saying that often. So for this example, if you are visualizing, then when you start hearing the lecturer says, how many companies did you? So you have some image for a company in your mind, maybe the stock exchange image or just the word company somewhere. And then one by one, he says different products. And then he says you interacted with 7 companies. So you'll see a group of companies there. Maybe you'll see the logo of big companies like Sony, Honda, Apple, Microsoft, etc. You'll see logos of those companies. And then he says they're involved in fraud. So then suddenly you'll see in your mind the same image that you're seeing here. It could be that, or you'll see some police and a judge and a fraud label punishing somewhere. And when he talks about the costs involved, you'll probably see a lot of money in your mind. Now, in the end, if you look at these pictures, these different company logos, a judge sentencing someone for fraud and a lot of money, maybe in a pile or a sack somewhere, then it is easy to construct, it's easy to remember what the speaker was talking about. That is, and then we can construct our response that the lecturer talks about the presence of corporations in our life and how many of them are involved in fraud. And then the one by one, you can, by referring to your mental image that you visualized, you can talk about the point, 7 companies, then 1 out of 7 are involved in fraud. And then finally, the money that you see, you can say that it costs the public this much. Finally, you can make a conclusion. There can be a couple of ways you conclude this. The lecturer says that this problem is to US, but there's no reason to believe that it's not the same in Europe. So you can say that it can be concluded that this is a worldwide problem. Or if you are not able to listen, remember, or understand all of that, then you can make a generic statement. It can be concluded that corporate fraud is a major problem in the world. So as we discussed, not always in the lecture section, the conclusion will not always end with it can be concluded. You can also make a more general observation that just like all other problems that are there in the US, this problem has also now found its way all over the world. Or the problem which is largely a US problem is now a problem for the whole world. So there are different ways you can make a conclusion, not necessarily that it has to begin with it can be concluded or in conclusion or to conclude. But yeah, as a template, if you want to remember, then feel free to make a sentence like that. Now you have these points, you have practiced, so you understand the structure. Then there are 10 seconds. So in those 10 seconds in your mind, you organize these points. In the introduction, okay, I'll talk about corporations and fraud. The first point will be interaction with the companies. Second will be their involvement in fraud. Third will be the cost to the public. And the final point will be my conclusion. So that's how you structure, so that when you start speaking, you don't have to pause and think what to say next. So use those 10 seconds that are given to you. So in a way, the answer should be in front of you, and maybe eyes closed or eyes open, and you have a structure of what you're going to say for each sentence. And then when the microphone opens up, just be confident and speak with good pronunciation and fluency. Shall we look at the next question now? All right, here we go.
Whether you like it or not, radical transparency and algorithmic decision-making is coming at you fast, and it's going to change your life. That's because it's now easy to take algorithms and embed them into computers and gather all that data that you're leaving on yourself all over the place, and know what you're like, and then direct the computers to interact with you in ways that are better than most people can. Well, that might sound scary. I've been doing this for a long time, and I have found it to be wonderful. My objective has been to have meaningful work and meaningful relationships with the people I work with, and I've learned that I couldn't have that unless I had that radical transparency and that algorithmic decision-making. I want to show you why that is. I want to show you how it works, and I warn you that some of the things that I'm going to show you probably are a little bit shocking. Since I was a kid, I've had a terrible rote memory, and I didn't like following instructions. I was no good at following instructions.
So as you have noticed, this is quite a long lecture. That's why if you just try to remember words, pick words, as you would have heard in the advice from some random YouTube videos, if you just try to pick words, you will most likely you will miss the main point. You will not even be able to understand half of the lecture. Therefore, your focus should always be that, I want to understand what this is about. And if you have that intent, then every word tells you something, points you in the right direction. So combination of what you're listening, the words that you're remembering, the notes that you are taking. So anything important that you hear, you can write down, because this is a long piece of audio, so there's a time to take notes, and the pictures that you create in your mind all will help you understand. Let's look at the sample response. The lecturer talks about the role that algorithms are poised to play in our lives. Now, these algorithms are used in almost all systems we interact with. Our data is analyzed by the algorithms, and the systems make decisions based on that. While this might sound invasive, it's actually useful in everyday life. The speaker cites his own personal experience to favor the use of algorithms in our life. The picture itself tells you that the lecture is going to be about algorithms, that the shapes and the arrows, it's like a general picture. It doesn't tell you anything specific. But what it does tell you is good enough, that the lecture is going to be about algorithms. And then you start hearing and you see the lecturer talks about algorithms, role, life, decision-making, transparency, all of this. And those are your key points. So if you were to visualize or you were to take notes, what will you have there? You'll have algorithms. So you'll have a similar kind of a picture in your mind, or you will have some kind of a machine which is making a decision, an AI which is taking in some input going in and some output coming in. So that kind of a decision making. So you might see, depending upon your personal experience, some of you might see a credit card application being processed by an algorithm, or some other kind of an application being reviewed automatically by a computer system and a decision given. So whichever way you remember, you try to remember it. An important point that I want to highlight here, the speaker starts talking about his childhood, all of those things, etc., etc. Now, we always have to focus on what the main thing in the lecture is. So don't get sidetracked by these supporting statements. We use it as a conclusion here. So, for example, we say that he uses his personal experience to favor the use of algorithms in our life. So this is like an overarching statement, the kind of statement we want to have in our conclusion. But we don't say that the speaker also talks about his childhood, the speaker talks about his childhood learning problems and all of that. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that always be clear what's important, what you're going to cover. And everything else, you don't need to remember it that much. All right. So I hope you were able to get all of these points in your response. See, if you are not able to, but you've captured them in a different way, that's fine. Don't bother yourself too much. As I've said, it all depends upon your target score. If your target score is 80, then you have to be perfect across all the departments. Get the content right, speak fluently, have good pronunciation. But if you are aiming for an average score, then average content and reasonable pronunciation and fluency is good enough. So push yourself only to the limit that's necessary. Let's look at the final question in this session now.
Today, we have technology that makes it cheap and easy for the government to collect information on ordinary, everyday people. Your phone call records can reveal whether you have an addiction, what your religion is, what charities you donate to, what political candidate you support. And yet, our government collected, dragnet style, Americans' calling records for years. In 2012, the Republican National Convention highlighted a new technology it was planning to use, facial recognition, to identify people who are going to be in the crowd, who might be activists or troublemakers, and to stop them ahead of time. Today, over 50% of American adults have their face print in a government database. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives concocted a plan to find out what Americans were going to gun shows by using license plate detectors to scan the license plates of cars that were in the parking lots of these events.
Here's a sample response. The speaker discusses how government is collecting the personal data of citizens and using it. Even an old technology like analyzing the phone call records can tell a lot about the people, from things like their religion to the charities and political candidates they support. Now, the government has also started using new technologies like facial recognition. More than half of the US population has its face prints in the government databases. This can be used for constructive purposes like national security, but might also have negative repercussions. So when you look at the image, what do you see? You see a person being scanned. Sometimes you see an image like this when we talk about an android or a bot or a robot or artificial intelligence. But yeah, in a general level, human beings and technology. So you can say that what the lecture that you're going to hear about will have something about human beings, technology, or like scanning the faces and things like that. And quite accurately, when the lecture starts, so discusses how the government is collecting personal data, but then also talks about facial recognition and all of that. See, sometimes what you think you're going to hear in the image, for example, if you thought this was going to be about artificial intelligence, it's not going to be. And the lecture nowhere mentions artificial intelligence. It's not about that, but it's somewhat related in the way that it's also technology and the use of technology to track the citizens. That is what the lecture is about. So be open when you start listening to And what you hear, let that guide you in the right direction. Okay, if you keep searching for artificial intelligence, then you will miss on other things. So as soon as they talk about data or technology, it's not about artificial intelligence as such, it's about more general use of technology in a different way. So that's why we say that you have to use all of these different techniques in combination. What you hear, what you remember, what you write down in your notes, and what you visualize. Okay, so based upon that, then you have your introductory sentence that it's about collecting the personal data of citizens and using it. And then the speaker talks about different ways the government was using it in past and the government is using it now. And so there are 3 points about that. And finally, a conclusion that this can be used for constructive purposes, but also might have negative repercussions. A more general conclusion could be, it can be concluded that there's a very high level of tracking of citizens by the US government. If you noticed in the lecture, they talk about Republican convention, parking, nameplates, etc., all those things. And we haven't mentioned that. So this is an important point that you need to understand. Everything is not equally important. So that was just another example of how the citizens are being tracked. Yeah, but we already have one example of facial recognition and face prints being in the databases. So we don't need to mention everything. And of course, you have to do this within the time limit. So in 40 seconds, this is the best that you can do. If you try to cover each point, you will probably give a response that is not very well structured. We want the response to start properly, have some key points, and then to end in a structured manner, which it does in this response, in this sample response. All right. So that's the end of this session. As always, take out some time and do the practice on your own as well.